Hey there, it's Justine. Before we launch into today's episode, I need to tell you about the Life and Faith survey. We're so glad for the responses we've already received, so thank you. We do need more responses though, so we have lots of data to work with. If you haven't yet taken the survey, then we need your input to make Life and Faith better and more fit for purpose. It will help us a lot as we shape the podcast into the future. The survey itself won't take long, probably about 5 minutes. Would you lend us 5 minutes of your time? We'd really appreciate it. We're running this for a few more weeks, and to say thank you, we'll put you in the running to win a signed copy of Tim Winton's book, Juice. Pretty good, right? All you need to do is go to the show notes to click on the link or go to the CPX website, publicchristianity.org. Thanks in advance for your help. Now on to the episode.
This week on Life and Faith.
Art can generate empathy in a way that history can't quite, and that theology can't quite, and that political science can't quite. They get to a certain point and then no further. And if you're a novelist, your job is to cross that boundary.
I worked before Taliban taking over and during and after Taliban taking over.
He's obviously feeling something very deeply.
Some people have chosen to cryogenically freeze their pets.
And so that can be a really hard experience.
Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart. Tim Winton is one of Australia's most loved writers. He is 30 books in and has become part of many Australians' lives. His latest novel, Juice, is set in the distant future, a time when climate catastrophe has wreaked havoc on the globe. Civilisation has crumbled, huge parts of the Earth in a band emanating from the equator are completely uninhabitable. It's all about the global unravelling that could accompany climate devastation, and it's frightening and sobering and really convincing. The novel opens with the first-person narrator on the road in the company of a little girl who is not his own, but is in his protection. And when they stop to inspect an old prospecting camp, they're taken hostage by a man with a crossbow. Locked in an enclosure at the bottom of a mine shaft, a conversation ensues between the two men. And it is from this setup that the story unfolds. And we're taken back to the main character's childhood, where he's eking out an existence with his single mother on a peninsula in Western Australia. Everyone lives underground in the summer months. Even winter is too hot. And their lives are subsistence and constricted. But there's another aspect to his life that really gets this story moving. He is recruited to the Service, a highly secretive organisation whose task is to eliminate the descendants of those responsible for the terrible damage to the Earth. Criminal dynasties, cartels and gangs are holed up in opulent, high-tech hideaways in unbelievable luxury. So the narrator's otherwise mundane life on the plane is punctuated by death-dealing missions, sort of wreaking vengeance on the people who've accumulated wealth and ravaged the earth. It's pretty wild and very captivating. Now, Tim Winton is well known for his passionate protection of fragile ecosystems like his beloved Ningaloo Reef. And now, as the grandfather to 6 children, he is clearly deeply concerned about what we might be leaving behind to them and those who come after them. Tim Winton came into the CPX studio to talk about Juice. Tim Winton, welcome back to Life and Faith. Great to see you.
Oh, thanks for having me back.
Now, the American writer Joy Williams, addressing other writers as they view the state of the world today, says, "We must write with a pen," in Mark Twain's phrase, "warmed up in hell." And then she says we might have something worthy and necessary. So I wanted to begin with, if you could comment on the potential role of fiction in changing people's perspectives.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good and potent question, and it's always been a good and potent question. I think during the 20th century, we got to a point where we expected less of art and we expected less of novels, in a way, where there was a kind of an expectation of ornamentation rather than punch. But the moments at which fiction has proved that it's more than ornamentation are significant. When the when the world economy collapsed at the end of the giddy 1920s, and people were suddenly jobless, homeless. There were a few brave writers who leant in, who seized the nettle and wrote about that. And similarly, on the heels of that, when the first great climate catastrophe of the 20th century in the Dust Bowl, when people just had to walk off flee their farms, landless, jobless, homeless, writers like John Steinbeck seized the nettle. And I guess, in a way, reminded us what the novel could do. It did change people's minds. Similarly, when the rise of fascism was happening in the 30s, most writers and artists, didn't want to go there for fear of opprobrium and looking partisan or a bit uncool. And also, the real live capacity of making a mistake, and getting it wrong. And they were called alarmists, a lot of them. And those brave people that went to Spain to participate in the resistance against fascism and write about it. Orwell and Hemingway, Marta Gellhorn. People did brave things, and I'm glad of that. And I think that writing did change people's perspective and shifted the mental furniture and the political furniture. It's not the novel's job to, rewrite legislation. So we have to be modest about our expectations as writers in particular. Yeah. But I think I think it's folly to assume that there's no power in art in general, in fiction in particular, and also that it's wrong to think that the artist is not also a citizen. Mm-hmm. And I think it's not just a problem for art. I think we've been trained into a kind of passivity of acceptance and submission to the status quo, business as usual, and it's not good for all of us because, I think otherwise we wouldn't be this miserable and unhappy and with such a capacity for self-harm.
It's interesting that all those people you mentioned, people are still reading these books and remembering them and studying them. They've been remembered, and that's notable.
Yeah, and I think they've been vindicated. Yeah. There's no question that their risk has been vindicated. And, Steinbeck is an interesting example. He was on the nose when I was a student. It was like he was unfashionable because he didn't venerate the individual. Yeah. And that's interesting to me. And So The Grapes of Wrath is a great novel of solidarity, across tribal lines, across class lines, across state lines, literally. And the older I get, the better Steinbeck seems. I used to get a little impatient of being compared to him, particularly in the UK. When Cloud Street came out, there was a lot of chat about it was reminding people of Steinbeck. And
you didn't like it?
No, it was weird.
Happier with that these days? Though.
Yeah, I'd take it, definitely. Yeah, a badge of honour.
Now, congratulations on Juice.
Thanks, mate.
I get the sense that all your novels are a huge challenge to write and a real wrestle, but what was particularly challenging about Juice, as you said? It took years, of course, and got the feeling it was a hard labour.
Yeah, it's tough. Again, it's a book that's attempting to meet the moment. And I suspect that the moment that we're on the brink of, or in the midst of, is bigger than any of those that we've been talking about. It's not really the beginning of a collapse of the economy, it's potentially the beginning of the collapse of the biosphere, which also promises the end of civility. So climate breakdown and social breakdown are just joined at the hip. So it's a tough thing to contend with as an artist because there's a huge resistance to dealing with it. People don't really want to know, and we can see the paralysis of our politics on this front. And it's a hard thing. So I guess I'm writing a long nightmare, and it's a nightmare that I want us to avoid because it's essentially a crime against life. Which, a crime against life, is a crime against everything. There is no greater crime. And it's unnecessary, it's avoidable, we have the capacity to do something about it. But it's difficult for us to get our heads around it because we talk about it in such abstract terms. So I felt as an artist, part of my job was to try to go to it and imagine my way into the lives, the everyday lives and bodies of those people who will be our family, our kin, our descendants. Imagine their reality if we don't step back and turn and undergo what the Pope, is pleading for, which is an ecological conversion.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So to put flesh on those concepts, so it's a tough feat of the imagination.
Especially as you become an evangelist for that conversion, there's a risk for the novelist that it becomes a bit clunky or preachy or something like that.
Yeah, I'm an artist, so I can't afford to be falling into agitprop or propaganda.
No.
It has to be organically intact. It has to be beautiful. And art, like Rilke's Angel. Rilke said every angel is terrible. I mean, beauty and terror are joined at the hip. They have to be big enough and important enough to seize our attention and claim our attention more than just in the moment. That's what constitutes a great work of art.
And it definitely does that. And as you describe it as a nightmare, I felt that very much, I have to say. But I wouldn't want people to be put off by that. It's not the sort of thing where you say, I can't face that. It's much more important, but also gripping. And as you say, you've put real flesh on the bones of this story. And this is where I think art does do something that other things couldn't quite do. I remember reading Christos Tsiolkos' book, Damascus, and we'd done a documentary on the history of Christianity, the good and the bad. And one of the key things that we talked about was the image of God status of every person. And I remember thinking, I think we did a good job of that. But when I read that novel, I thought, this gets you in the gut in a way that what we'd done didn't. It didn't quite carry the same power but as what he gave us.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's just being able to be inside people for a while, I mean, I think about, my youth. If I'd had more opportunities to be exposed to imaginative explorations and iterations, shall we say, of that historical stuff, I would have understood more. And I think art can kind of generate empathy in a way that history can't quite, and that theology can't quite, and that political science can't quite. They get to a certain point and then no further because they're not licensed to do that. Right. And if you're a novelist, your job is to cross that boundary.
I wonder if historical fiction, the popularity of historical fiction might speak a little bit to that. It's got some challenges as well, though, of course. Now, the narrator in the story is someone who feels so subject to circumstances beyond his control or even understanding. And everything that has happened before, that contributes to that, even the things that control his life as he develops. But he has some agency too, doesn't he? And I feel he's someone who takes action and he's admirable in that way. And I feel like there's something you're saying to us in that you admire him for that. And it feels like a message to us.
Yeah, I think we are subject to forces beyond our control in terms of the way society is organised and the way the economy is run. And many of us have been, in terms of the climate emergency, we've been sold this idea of individuation and individual responsibility. And that's a conscious strategy by the lobbyists of the fossil fuel, the big polluters, to make us feel bad about our carbon footprint, which is something they invented, when really we're subject. And our polity, the way the politics is organised, is essentially making us feel helpless and divided and confused. And there's this kind of low burning fever of despair creeping amongst people. So I guess what I've learnt over the last 10 years, and some of it's from younger people who are active in the climate movement, and some of it's from people who are in their last stages of life who are active as well, is just how important it is and how possible it is to reclaim our agency, to seize the nettle and to do something. And, all those years I spent in Sunday school, not all of which I appreciated, but there was this ringing thing that came up all the time: by their fruit shall ye know them. And it was like everyone's got this talk. They're talking about their values and what they represent and what they're going to do for you. But in the end, you can register what people are, what their values are, by what they do, and the gap between their propaganda and rhetoric. So I think as individuals, we need to be able to remember that we are part of a community, that we're stronger when we're in relationships and alliances, and that together we can reclaim our agency, and as a demos, as a chain of villages, however you want to imagine the broader community, to reclaim our agency. And also, part of the book's force, I suppose, or attempted force, is to bring it close, not for it to remain safely abstract. Really, you find out who people are when the fire is at the fence. Yep. You know, when it's outside the village and it's getting inside the fence. That's where you see how the greatness of people, you know, the essential goodness of people. I think the world is good, and we are born of the world, and we are good, and people want to be good. You know, there's a lot of complications around it, but people want to be good. And you see the very best in people, in extremis, and people just drop their ancient hatreds when the fire's at the fence, and they join together to defend the house, the village behind that. And that's the best in people, and that's what we need to recover. And under the market, the genius of the market, and the kind of the neoliberal religion we've been sold, it's really the most successful religious movement in modern history. I mean, that's what we're subject to. We've been sold this idea that we're just small, divided. It's dog eat dog. It's this war of all against all. We're competitors, not allies, not comrades. So yeah, that's what I was trying for, and I hope some of that comes through.
This is Life and Faith, and I'm speaking with Tim Winton, whose new novel, Juice, is out now. I was struck by the fact that in Juice, the main character and his mother are living a very subsistence kind of existence. It's all work and no play. And what felt like a distinct lack of joy. There's never any sense of feasting or celebration of any kind, because their lives are all about survival. And it felt like there was a real warning in this. Here's Tim again.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we don't understand about what's coming if we don't extract the digit is the harshness and the diminishment of life and of our bodies. I mean, I'm writing about these people who are living with, a level of increased heat that essentially changes your lifespan. People's fertility rates are down. The hours in which you can be under the naked sky in a year are quite limited, yeah. Your aspirations, your expectations, your sense of promise, all these things are ground down. So even people's imaginations are ground down, because essentially you're just trying to survive. You haven't got anything left over it's hard to generate any kind of excess, and with that you trade. So yeah, feasting and joy. I mean, people in this book have become almost afraid to enjoy themselves.
Yeah. Now, the Service is a highly secretive organisation whose task is to eliminate or acquit the people who are from a long line of those responsible for the terrible damage to the earth. And so this group are the ones taking action. But I want to talk to you about their methods, because they are incredibly violent. It's ruthless, cold. There's sort of an efficiency to this. And it seems to come at a cost to the people who are dishing out that punishment. Is there something of a warning here for where things could be headed, but also what it does to our humanity in that process?
Yeah, and I don't think this is really a message from the future. This is a message from history, really. Yeah. I mean, we see the fruit of humiliation. What happens to a people, a class of people, a country of people, when they're subjects, basically, when their lands are occupied, when they're humiliated daily, when they have no equality, and where the level of disrespect or contempt, really, their experience just damages them. It paralyses them for a while, and it kind of, that humiliation metastasizes in them, and they try all the polite means of seeking redress and seeking justice and fairness, and they just give up asking after a while, and they resort to the last means of change, which is violent action, which of course sets off things that you can't undo. And of course our news feeds are full of, the result of that, every day and night. And so they have this resistance movement which has its own logic, but, how do you unhook from the logic? Where do you stop? What are the parameters? And also the cost to your own humanity is corrosive, and it's very hard to maintain some sense of, what comes after.
Yep.
What's left of us by the time we get liberty. Yeah, so I guess the seeds of that question are planted pretty early in the book, and you can feel, I suspect, as a reader, particularly those people who are sort of more conscious of the political and economic factors, that are essentially the crimes that we're seeing in our own time and on our own dime and in our names. There's a lot of pent-up rage in the community of our world today. So when the names of these criminals emerge in the book, there's a kind of a shock of recognition, but also a kind of burst of kind of an atavistic pleasure in a way of this. It feels righteous for a moment, and then you think, hang on. Yeah, and you think, hang on, this is awful. So you feel implicated in this kind of sort of impulse for revenge, and then you have to live with what that really means.
Now, the main character does come to understand what the world was like in the past. Oceans teeming with life, lush forests and rivers and rich plains and all that. And it's a terrible shock to him. But a bigger shock for him is the kind of anguish when he discovers that the people in the past knew that this was happening and didn't do anything about it. You feel, Tim, your own anguish at this point in the story.
Yeah, I think that's the hard bit. Everybody wants to think that their ancestors had at least some level of nobility. And look, we're in Australia, a settler society. That's something that we're just trying to digest and come to terms with all the time, as you find out more and more about just what colonialism cost the first peoples and just how it's poisoned our culture to some degree, and how we need to come to terms with it and make some restitution, in some way. But this guy just realises that his ancestors were monsters. They were callous, selfish, nihilistic. They knew they were poisoning the world to come, and they just didn't care. And that just robs you of any meaning. And until that point, he feels like a competent young homesteader. He knows how to survive in his tough world, but then he finds out that, he's basically been damned for the sins of others.
He's subject to this.
And the injustice of that, everybody around him. And of course, he sees images of what those people used to look like. Their body weight was, double. They have these big, shiny cheeks. They have flesh on their bones. Their skin is shiny. They're not covered in sores, and they don't have rickets. Is it rickets? I can't remember what they... Yeah,
rickets where you lack the vitamins.
From sunlight, because they live half the...
Or scurvy.
It was both.
A bit of both.
So it's, again, it's humiliating, but also there's a kind of an original sin there that he just can't cope with. There's no way back from that. So in a sense, it's, as a person who's living in this dispensation, during this period, that could be consigning our loved ones, our grandchildren's grandchildren, to lives of misery, and which will essentially strip the middle of the globe of all humanity and much life. It's a pretty big deal to realise that this is happening now, and we know about it. So it's trying to put flesh on wasted, sad, sun-ravaged flesh on an idea.
One of my team here is reading the book and said, I can just see this movie with Chris Hemsworth, starring the role. I thought, he might have to go on he might not be able to eat for 6 months before he does it.
And he's too tall as well. I'm seeing Guy Pearce.
Poor Guy Pearce. Yeah, even still, he'll have to starve himself for a bit. But it is all very, you mentioned original sin. It is very east of Eden, isn't it, this story? The toil, the struggle. And you do refer directly to the Genesis narrative, with a character talking about the gaining of knowledge from the forbidden fruit. But the line is, but there's grief in that knowledge. With the gift comes the burden of acting on it. And that's a huge part of this story.
Yeah, and I think the burden of being required to act on knowledge, is a central part of the human condition, But it's also, while it's an obligation, it's just this endless opportunity. That's what sets us apart as a species, Even knowing that we'll die, we can change ourselves and we can change our circumstances and we can make choices. I mean, that's just remarkable, you know. And given the gift of organic life and the unlikeliness of it, in all that dark space, anoxic space, there's this one rock that runs around a star and all these miracles pop up out of it, and we're part of that, But I guess, in the world of this book, people have been expelled, not by their own behaviour, but they've been expelled from the garden by their parents, if you like, by their ancestors.
I've always felt with your work, and I didn't feel differently after this, that you somehow have a faith in the people to kind of get their act together, that there's something redemptive in every one of your stories. This was pushing the limits of it, but it was there still. You still think there's a reason to keep talking, right, and keep encouraging people to act.
Yeah, I mean, the setup of the story is there's a guy down a mine shaft. He's a captive by another guy, and he's telling this story to, pass the time and to defer his death, if you like. He's telling stories to save his life. But he's also telling stories to try to break through to this other guy and to make him see, or to offer himself as an ally, and to suggest to him that each of them has skills and they have a child with them to consider. The narrator of the story is travelling with a child who's not his child, and he's been commissioned with her protection. He's just trying to find the decency, find the light in his captor, to say that, look, three of us stand a better chance. I mean, you just see us as two more mouths to feed, but we've got skills. The three of us together, that's the beginning of community, and our odds are better. And why don't we try that, So it's essentially a determined, stubborn refusal to submit to savagery, and darkness and nihilism. And he's just going to peck away to the very last moment, trying to appeal to the guy. And in that sense, I think the refusal to submit to cynicism and despair, there's a vein of that runs through the book, against the dark background of what's happening. And people won't be surprised to know that the book ends on a sort of teetering moment, which is kind of probably irritatingly predictable for me.
Well, definitely irritating. I was a bit, come on, he's done it to me again.
But I think in my defence, I think it reflects the gravity and the jeopardy of our moment.
Yeah.
Are we going to reach for the light? And ultimately, I mean, the title juice is, on the face of it, it's really about energy and the stuff that we use, makes our machines go. But it's also, people in the book ask each other, have you got the juice to keep going? Have you got the juice to make the hard decision? And I guess I'm posing the question, have we got the juice to make the right choice? Because ultimately, the climate conundrum is a wicked problem. It's very complex. But the solution really comes down to a very, very basic, fundamental choice. Do we have the juice to make the right decision? And the choice is, are we on the side of life or are we on the side of the money? And really that's all it comes down to. Once you make the choice either way, that's your path. And life is the light. Life is saying yes to the gift. And the other is servitude. I mean, old Bob was right back in the day. You got to serve somebody. You might not know, but everything you do is either in service of the light or the dark. It's for life or it's against life.
Now, there's a point in the book where one character says, I'm going to quote here, "My mother used to tell me that when nature dies, God dies along with her. And she said the first form of revelation is the natural world. This was, I thought, a really important part of the book. And I think you're trying to press into that a little bit and talk to people about what they've lost once they lose contact with the natural world in the way that many of us already have, but are in danger of, for sure. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that, about this sort of sense of the natural world being a bit of a pointer to the Creator and what that sort of message is for us.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know if people have really understood the consequences of the kinds of losses that are in store for humanity if we continue on this path of heating to 3 degrees, just, essentially where we're at. The world's community trying to stay at 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial times. There's losses involved with that. That's not going to be fun. But we're currently on track for 3 degrees. Everything about human life will be diminished, and there'll be so little nature. This is what I fear, that there'll be so little in the natural world, so little beauty, so little respite, so little clemency and kindness, that it will be almost impossible to sustain a religious impulse. That probably frightens me as much as anything else. And also in Australia, people don't really realise that the north of Australia will empty out. We'll be witnessing the second and perhaps most consequential dispossession of our first peoples for a start. Right. And they're all going to end up in the south. Yeah. But I think that we just don't take seriously enough the potency of the natural world and how it's the window to our imagination. Clearly it includes our religious imagination, our capacity to think transcendent thoughts and to act in a way that reflects that. All the creative impulses in humanity are mirrors and avatars of the creative process that's entrained and engendered in the creation. And to be robbed of that is a loss that I just don't think we're really coming to terms with yet. And yeah, we are living in a much diminished creation because of our rapacity, and the way that we're kind of embellishing and gilding the present by looting the future, which is immoral. I mean, it's just completely immoral. It's not just illogical, it's immoral. And people ask me, how do you go on, when life's tough, and how do you recharge? How do you keep going? And obviously it's a natural world and it's people, but we forget that people are the natural world. Mm-hmm. People are products of the natural world. They are flowers of creation. So I feel like I can withstand the hot flames of despair because I can take solace and recharge and feel the miracles in creation, just the air, the water, the soil, the creatures, the plants, and the children. Yeah. That's where grace is closest. That's where it's most touchable. And I don't make any distinction between my grandchildren's faces and a dolphin jumping out of the water or a beautiful flower or the smell of the sea wind,
Right, in the sense that they're all part of this miracle of life.
Yeah, they're all just, miracles dancing.
I wonder if the way we've come at somehow, many of us, disconnected from the natural world, and so much of it's online and cut off from sources of production, these sorts of things, whether that contributes to our apathy or our kind of, we're not as passionate about this as we should be.
Yeah, it's part of the disconnection. We're living in our heads. We're living into this sort of weird dispensation of ideas and ideologies, which is why I talk about the idea of, the fence is on fire, the yard's on fire, it's us in the house, it's you and your neighbours. And at that level, we pay attention, because then you drop your tablet, you're not quite worried about your Bluetooth connection, it's like, where the heck is the bucket? Yeah. And look, everyone had plenty of fun slinging off at Scotty from marketing about not holding the hose, but we're all pretty good at telling each other that we don't hold a hose, mate. But the good thing is that when it comes to it, people do and will, and we just need to.
I want to ask you about resurrection and the hope contained within the Christian story of redemption and mending of broken things. It's broken relationships, broken people, injustice, all those sorts of things, but also mending of the creation of itself, which is, the ultimate vision of that story. I wonder what you could say about resources there are within the Christian frame to offer this predicament that we have. Could it be a motivating force for action as well as a way of avoiding complete despair?
Yeah, and again, I think part of the problem of, some of the mainstream iterations of that focuses very much on the individual, and everything has to hang on the nail of either an event in history or a personal iteration of that event. And it's a big leap for lots of people to be able to make that and stick with it as a concept, as an idea, when you are surrounded by regeneration in the natural world, when you are surrounded by opportunities and instances of restitution that you see in society. So I just think we need, again, put more flesh on the bones and socialise that a little more and make it more sacramental in the sense of make it more organic about life rather than about concepts, because we get hung up on these orthodoxies and the experiences somehow get put to the side, So I do see huge opportunities for us to be a part of a regenerative, restorative process which requires humility, because I think part of our problem, the problem of where we find ourselves as a species on the brink of oblivion is because of a lack of humility. We're in a kind of prideful delusion, and it's bad for people, clearly. It's bad for the world, and what's bad for the world is bad for people. What's bad for people is bad for the world.
Well, I think it was Joan Baez who said that action is the antidote to despair. I feel like you'd probably say amen to that.
Yeah, I think so. And I'm proud of belonging to a tradition which celebrates solidarity and action. And I think we forget all that as well. I mean, this is a movement that started about solidarity, about the kind of decision to care and the recognition of being cared for and reaching out to others to extend that care and getting organised and doing something about it.
Well, Tim, it's so good to have you in. The book's fabulous. It's getting great reviews, which I'm glad, and I hope it gets the reception it deserves. And we're so grateful for your time. Thanks for coming in.
Oh, thanks, Simon.
This has been Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart. A huge thanks to Tim Winton for coming into the studio to talk about his new novel Juice, which is out now and getting rave reviews. From next week, you can also listen to Tim's Richard Johnson lecture for CPX on a similar theme to what he tackles in Juice and what you've heard today. Go to the Richard Johnson podcast for that, or our site at publicchristianity.org. And thanks to our producer, the fully juiced Alan Douthwaite. Next week.
I remember actually driving home in my company car in a job I was doing well at. I felt like, I was progressing, opportunities were opening up. But I remember just the sense of emptiness that just came over me. And I started weeping. I started crying in the car thinking, my God, is this all I'm going to do? I'm just going to try to sell more stuff. That's going to be the point of all these hours I'll spend working.